The elder is resting well. Yes, he had a long day. Let's keep watch. Who are you? What is this place?
I have been waiting for you. Enter.
What do you want from me?
Your destiny. The fire! It must burn hotter!
I feel his power. Hold him steady. It burns.
Endure it!
Thank you. These look wonderful. You're welcome. Enjoy them.
He has the best tomatoes.
I will. Good morning, everyone. Need any help with that? Here, take some fruit. Gather close, children. Tonight's story is a tale of courage. In village Tawas, a young boy set out on a...
Kafanshan was a city that never truly slept, a restless place where the sun struck the zinc rooftops so fiercely it sounded like invisible drummers beating war rhythms from the sky. And in one aging family compound at the edge of the crowded marketplace lived two brothers whose destinies were tied together long before they understood the meaning of rivalry or sacrifice. Zachary Bellew, the elder brother, carried charm on his face like a carefully worn mask. He laughed easily, spoke smoothly, and greeted neighbors with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him applause, yet beneath that polished exterior his heart simmered with silent hunger, a craving not just for success but for superiority, while his younger brother Dinladi moved through life with a gentleness that felt almost old-fashioned, bowing to elders, sharing food without counting portions, and helping strangers even when his own pockets were nearly empty. Their father, Bello Musa, had once been a respected trader, a man whose word carried weight in community meetings and whose advice was sought during disputes, but illness had reduced him to a shadow of himself 5 years earlier, his breathing turning rough and uneven as if each inhale scraped against thorns inside his chest, and on the night everyone knew the end was near he called both sons to his bedside under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. Mama Hawa stood quietly at the corner of the room, wiping tears with the edge of her wrapper as the old man's trembling hands reached beneath his pillow and brought out a small leather pouch darkened by age, its surface marked with faint symbols passed down through generations, and his voice, though weak, carried a seriousness that froze the air when he declared that within that pouch rested a blessing guarded by their ancestors for 7 generations, a blessing that multiplied the efforts of a pure heart but turned into a curse against anyone driven by greed. He looked first at Zachary and said that strength and intelligence were gifts, but a heart hardened by envy could ruin even the strongest man, and those words pierced deeper than any insult because Zachary had always expected praise, not warning. Then the father turned to Dinladi, calling him soft-hearted yet wise, and placed the pouch into his hands with the final instruction that it must never be used for selfish ambition, only for good, because power without goodness destroys its owner. 3 days later Bello Musa was buried beneath red earth, and while mourners offered prayers and neighbors brought bowls of rice and stew, something darker than grief began to grow inside Zachary's chest, a swelling resentment that twisted every time he saw the pouch resting against Dinladi's neck, worn like a sacred trust. At first nothing seemed different, but within months Dinladi's struggling provision shop began attracting customers from distant streets, his modest business expanding without aggressive marketing or cunning negotiation, and people whispered that fortune had smiled upon him, yet he remained humble, sharing profits with his mother and even lending small amounts to struggling vendors without demanding interest. Meanwhile, every venture Zachary attempted seemed to crumble, investments failed mysteriously, partnerships dissolved in suspicion, and crops withered before harvest as if the soil rejected his touch, and though coincidence could explain each setback individually, together they formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. Instead of questioning his own impatience or harsh dealings, Zachary convinced himself that what rightfully belonged to him had been stolen by birth order's unfairness, and he began to believe that being firstborn entitled him to every inheritance, spiritual or material, because in his mind leadership was not about character but hierarchy. As evenings fell and the compound quieted, he would sit alone watching Dinladi return home smiling after successful sales, neighbors praising his kindness, and Mama Hawa blessing him openly, and each compliment felt like a small stone thrown at Zachary's pride until one night, beneath a sky thick with slow-moving clouds, he whispered the thought that would change everything. The blessing should be his, not because he earned it, but because he desired it, and desire in the wrong heart can grow into something more dangerous than hatred. It can grow into justification. Jealousy, when it is fed in silence, grows teeth, and by the time the Harmattan winds began sweeping dust through the streets of Kafanchan, Zachary's envy had matured into something sharp and restless, something that would not let him sleep peacefully at night. He had watched for 2 full years as Dinladi's modest provision shop multiplied into 3 flourishing stores scattered across town, each one stocked with fresh goods, each one busy from sunrise until long after dusk, while his own ventures collapsed like huts built on sand, and the more he failed the more convinced he became that the leather pouch resting against his brother's chest was not merely symbolic but the source of everything good flowing into that household. Dinladi remained unchanged by his prosperity, still kneeling before elders, still laughing with children in the street, still counting money only after ensuring Mama Hawa had enough for food and medicine, and this consistency enraged Zachary more than arrogance ever could, because humility left no flaw to criticize and no excuse to attack, so instead of confronting his brother openly, he began studying him quietly, observing how the pouch never left Dinladi's neck, how even during bathing it hung within arm's reach, how at night he slept with it resting against his skin like a heartbeat inherited from their father. The warning spoken years earlier echoed occasionally in Zachary's mind that the blessing multiplied purity and destroyed wickedness, but he dismissed it as exaggerated folklore meant to frighten children, and once a man convinces himself that consequences are myths, he becomes dangerous not only to others but to himself. One evening, after overhearing traders at the market praise Dinladi as the fortunate son of Bello Musa, Zachary felt humiliation burn hotter than the setting sun, and that was the night he decided that if success would not come to him honestly, he would take it by force. Yet stealing an object guarded day and night required more than courage, it required knowledge of darker paths, and in Kafanchan there was one name whispered whenever people sought help beyond the visible world, Yawan, the woman who lived where the town's last houses dissolved into bushland. Some called her healer, others witch, some claimed she had once saved a barren woman from despair, others swore she had ruined men who broke promises, but everyone agreed on one thing: Yawan's power came with a price that could not be negotiated. Her compound stood beneath twisted trees that seemed to lean inward as if listening, their branches tangled like fingers frozen mid-dance, and the walls of her house were painted red and black in uneven strokes that looked almost alive at night. Even during daylight few dared approach without invitation, and children were warned never to play near her gate. It was close to midnight when Zachary wrapped himself in dark cloth and walked alone through silent streets, past sleeping houses and shuttered stalls, his heart beating faster with each step, not from fear of spirits but from fear of being seen by human eyes, because wicked plans prefer shadows. When he reached the narrow path leading to Yawan's compound, the air felt heavier, cooler, scented with something bitter and unfamiliar, and though he hesitated for a brief second, pride pushed him forward until he stood before her wooden door and knocked 3 times. The door creaked open without delay, as though she had been waiting, and there she stood, an elderly woman with milky eyes reflecting candlelight, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist, her presence both fragile and intimidating at once. Without greeting she turned and walked inside, assuming he would follow, and Zachary obeyed, stepping into a dim room lit only by green-flamed candles whose smoke curled toward the ceiling like restless spirits. The smell inside was thick with herbs and burnt feathers, and a pot bubbled softly in the corner though no firewood was visible beneath it, and when Yawan finally spoke her voice sounded dry and sharp, cutting through silence like a blade through cloth as she told him he had not come seeking healing or protection but theft, and the certainty in her tone stripped away any hope of pretending innocence. Zachary swallowed his pride and admitted that his brother possessed something that belonged to him, a blessing given unfairly because birth order should have determined inheritance, and at that Yawan laughed, a low, echoing sound that seemed to bounce off the walls, and asked whether he understood that the blessing carried a curse attached, whether he truly believed he could wear power meant for purity without consequence. Yet greed has a way of silencing reason, and Zachary insisted he would pay whatever price was required to claim what he believed destiny owed him, not realizing that destiny listens carefully when challenged and often answers in ways men do not expect. Yawan did not immediately answer Zachary's desperate declaration that he would pay any price for the blessing. Instead she circled him slowly like a hawk studying prey, her bare feet silent against the cracked cement floor while the green candle flames flickered violently as though reacting to the tension thickening the room, and when she finally stopped before him her milky eyes seemed to look beyond his skin and bone into the restless ambition beating inside his chest. She told him that the blessing he desired was older than both of them, older even than his father, and that it responded not to status or seniority but to the moral weight of a man's heart. Yet if he insisted on forcing destiny's hand there was indeed a way to attempt it, though the path would not be clean nor easily walked. Zachary leaned forward on the small wooden stool, his throat dry but his resolve hardened by years of comparison and humiliation, and Yahweh explained that to remove a spiritual inheritance from its rightful bearer required 3 offerings that symbolized death, intimacy, and personal sacrifice. Because power stolen without cost rarely stays loyal, first, he must bring water gathered at midnight from the soil of a freshly dug grave, not rainwater resting on the surface, but moisture squeezed from earth that had tasted human finality. Second, he must cut a strand of hair from his brother's head while Dinladi slept, taken without waking him so that innocence remained unaware of betrayal. And third, he must mix a drop of his own blood with tears shed from genuine frustration, not false regret, proving that even in wickedness he was willing to wound himself. The instructions sent a shiver crawling down Zachary's spine, yet greed quickly smothered hesitation, and he agreed before fully understanding the spiritual symbolism woven into each demand, because a man obsessed with outcome rarely studies the road leading toward it. Yahweh warned him again that once begun, this ritual could not be reversed halfway, that curses do not negotiate with indecision, and that if he failed to follow every condition precisely the backlash would be severe. But Zachary heard only the promise of access, not the threat of destruction, and he left her compound clutching determination like a weapon against fear. The following night he found himself standing inside the town's quiet graveyard beneath a sky partially veiled by restless clouds, the moonlight pale and uncertain as it spilled over crooked headstones casting long shadows that resembled reaching arms. And though every snapping twig made his pulse spike, he forced himself toward a recently buried mound where the soil was still soft. Kneeling down, he pressed a small calabash into the damp earth, squeezing until murky water seeped upward, cold and unpleasant against his fingers, and as he sealed it tightly he felt a strange awareness that he had crossed a boundary separating ordinary wrongdoing from something deeper, something that left marks invisible but permanent. The next challenge required entering his brother's room, and that moment tested him more than the graveyard because betrayal committed in proximity feels heavier than theft done in darkness. Dinladi slept peacefully, the leather pouch resting against his chest rising and falling with each calm breath. And for a fraction of a second Zachary saw not a rival but the boy who once shared roasted corn with him under mango trees, yet memory dissolved under ambition as he carefully clipped a single strand of hair, retreating before conscience could strengthen its voice. The final requirement demanded solitude, and inside his own room Zachary pricked his finger with a needle, watching a bright bead of blood form before letting it fall into a small bowl where tears, drawn not from remorse but from anger at perceived injustice, joined it. The mixture symbolic of how resentment and sacrifice can merge into dangerous determination. 3 days later, he returned to Yahweh's compound carrying the collected items wrapped in cloth, and she accepted them without praise, pouring the grave water, the hair, and the blood tears mixture into a blackened pot already simmering with substances he dared not identify. She chanted in a language that rolled like distant thunder while stirring clockwise and then counterclockwise, disrupting balance intentionally. And as steam rose it carried a scent so sharp it made Zachary's eyes water uncontrollably, though he refused to step back. After a long silence she poured the thickened liquid into a small glass bottle and handed it to him with strict instruction. The potion would place Dinladi into a sleep deeper than ordinary rest, granting several hours to remove the pouch, but once the blessing touched his own skin the true test would begin. For he would have exactly 7 days to perform a genuinely selfless act, costing him something valuable, something painful to surrender, and only through that act could the blessing accept him rather than transform into the curse embedded within it. Zachary barely listened to the warning, intoxicated already by the thought of imminent reversal of fortune, and as he paid Yahweh the last of his savings she looked at him with a mixture of inevitability and faint pity, whispering that destiny often grants people what they chase not to reward them but to reveal them, a statement he dismissed as superstition while clutching the bottle that would soon unravel the fragile balance holding his world together. The night Zachary chose to act arrived quietly, without thunder or warning, as if the universe itself had stepped aside to observe what a single decision could unleash, and the compound lay wrapped in deep silence broken only by distant crickets and the occasional restless rooster confused by moonlight. Inside his small room Zachary held the glass bottle Yahweh had given him, watching the dark liquid swirl thickly against the glass as his pulse thudded in his ears like ceremonial drums announcing either celebration or disaster, and for a fleeting moment he considered abandoning the plan, yet pride reminded him of years spent standing in his brother's shadow, of watching neighbors praise Dinladi's kindness while his own efforts collapsed unnoticed, and that bitterness drowned hesitation as surely as water extinguishes flame. Moving carefully, he stepped into Dinladi's room where the air felt warmer, calmer, and almost sacred, the leather pouch resting against his brother's chest glowing faintly under lantern light as though aware of approaching danger, and Zachary uncorked the bottle, waving the potion gently beneath Dinladi's nose. Within seconds his brother's breathing deepened unnaturally, his body falling into a stillness too complete to resemble ordinary sleep, and when Zachary pressed his hand against Dinladi's shoulder there was no reaction at all, only silence heavy as stone. His fingers trembled as they reached for the leather cord, and the instant he touched it a shock rippled through him like grasping a live wire, causing him to gasp and nearly retreat, yet greed steadied his resolve and he unclasped the pouch from around his brother's neck, whispering to himself that destiny was merely correcting an old mistake. As he placed it over his own head the pouch felt unexpectedly warm, almost pulsing against his chest like a second heartbeat, syncing with his own, and though unease brushed against his thoughts he forced himself back to his room before Dinladi could awaken from enchanted sleep. Morning arrived bright and deceptively peaceful, sunlight spilling across the compound as if nothing unnatural had occurred, and Zachary woke to an astonishing sight, crisp banknotes resting on his windowsill, real money placed there without explanation, and he stared at them in disbelief before laughter burst from his chest, a wild sound of triumph he struggled to contain. Within hours Mama Hawa informed him that a businessman from Lagos had come seeking partnership in a large supply contract, leaving contact details and promising profit beyond anything Zachary had previously imagined, and as he stepped outside he noticed neighbors greeting him with sudden respect, their tones shifting from casual familiarity to cautious admiration, as though invisible forces had adjusted their perception overnight. Across the compound, however, Dinladi awoke with confusion pressing against his temples, his head throbbing painfully as if struck from within, and when his hand instinctively reached for the pouch that had rested on his chest every night for years he found only empty skin, panic surged through him, swift and suffocating, and he searched his bedding, his shelves, even the corners of the room as Mama Hawa rushed in responding to his frantic shouts, yet no trace of the leather pouch remained. Zachary entered moments later feigning concern, arranging his face into an expression of shock while inside exhilaration coursed through him like a secret victory parade, and though Dinladi could not comprehend how the pouch vanished from a locked room his distress carried no suspicion, only heartbreak, because to him the pouch symbolized his father's final blessing rather than financial fortune. Days turned into weeks and the contrast between the brothers sharpened with unsettling speed. Zachary's ventures flourished effortlessly, the Lagos contract finalized with astonishing ease, his once failing farm yielding crops so abundant that buyers lined up before harvest, and he purchased a new vehicle whose polished surface reflected not only sunlight but his swelling pride. Meanwhile, Dinladi's businesses faltered inexplicably, customers dwindling as though drawn elsewhere by unseen currents, goods spoiling before sale, small mechanical failures multiplying until he was forced to close 2 of his shops, and whispers began circulating through Kafanchan that fortune had mysteriously shifted allegiance. Mama Hawa observed these changes with troubled eyes, remembering her husband's warning about purity and consequence, and though she said little she sensed imbalance creeping through her household like slow-moving smoke, yet Zachary dismissed all caution, convinced that the blessing had finally recognized its rightful heir and that previous failures had been mere obstacles delaying inevitable greatness. What he conveniently ignored was Yawan's final instruction echoing faintly beneath his celebration. Within 7 days he must perform a truly selfless deed costing him something valuable, an act not staged for appearance but born from genuine sacrifice, and though opportunities appeared, a neighbor needing help with hospital bills, a widow struggling to repair her leaking roof, Zachary postponed generosity each time, telling himself he would give later when his wealth felt secure enough to spare. By the end of the 3rd week his success tasted sweet as honey, yet beneath the surface something subtle began to change. The pouch's warmth intensified at night, shifting from comforting heat to uncomfortable burn, and though he adjusted it repeatedly against his skin he convinced himself it was imagination, unaware that blessings stolen without cleansing do not remain silent forever, and as he lay on his bed clutching plans for expansion, convinced he had mastered destiny, the first faint spark of the curse flickered quietly against his chest, waiting for the moment when pride would leave him most unguarded. Success intoxicates faster than palm wine, and by the time 3 full weeks had passed since the pouch changed owners, Zachary walked through Kafanchan with the confidence of a man who believed heaven had finally corrected an injustice, his new contracts expanding, his bank account swelling, and his once mocking neighbors now greeting him with respectful nods, yet beneath his polished shirts the leather pouch had begun to feel different, no longer warm like living breath, but hot in a way that lingered against his skin long after sunset, and though discomfort whispered warnings, he ignored them the way proud men ignore cracks in foundations until walls begin to tremble. One afternoon, as he returned from the bank carrying a heavy bag of freshly withdrawn cash intended for another investment, he passed through the crowded market where vendors shouted prices over the scent of frying akra and dust hung lazily in golden light. And there by the roadside sat an elderly woman whose thin frame seemed carved from exhaustion, her wrapper faded and torn, her cough deep and rattling like something inside her chest was breaking apart. She stretched a trembling hand toward him and pleaded softly that she had not eaten in 2 days, that her children had abandoned her, that the clinic refused treatment without payment, and for a brief suspended second Zachary felt the echo of Yahweh's warning ring clearly in his mind. 7 days, a selfless deed, something costly. But instead of compassion rising, suspicion and pride hardened his heart, convincing him that beggars exaggerated suffering, that his money was meant for expansion not charity, and he stepped past her without breaking stride, dismissing her whispered blessing turned warning as the rambling of desperation. That evening he counted his profits with satisfaction, planning new purchases and imagining respect multiplying around him like applause, yet as night deepened and silence settled across the compound, the pouch's heat intensified suddenly, violently, searing against his chest as if a coal had been pressed directly onto flesh. He awoke with a scream, clawing at the cord around his neck as the burning sensation spread outward in sharp pulses, and when he attempted to rip it free the clasp refused to open, fused tighter than metal, as though the leather itself had become part of his skin. Panic replaced pride instantly, his confident composure dissolving into raw fear as he stumbled into the courtyard shouting for help, his voice cracking in agony while Mama Hawa rushed from her room and Dinladi followed close behind, both frozen at the sight of Zachary writhing on the ground clutching his chest. Beneath his torn shirt the skin surrounding the pouch had begun turning dark, not bruised, but blackened like charred wood, and the smell of scorched flesh mingled with night air as he begged for water, mercy, anything to extinguish the invisible fire consuming him from within. Dinladi instinctively knelt to help despite weeks of personal loss, and when his eyes fell upon the leather pouch hanging from Zachary's neck realization struck him with painful clarity, the missing inheritance now revealed in the worst possible way, yet anger did not overpower compassion as easily as one might expect, because witnessing suffering, even deserved suffering, softens the heart of someone accustomed to mercy. They tried cutting the cord with scissors, but the blades snapped uselessly, attempted prying it loose with a knife that dulled instantly against the leather, and poured water across Zachary's chest only to watch steam rise, as though the liquid touched heated iron. The burning did not remain localized, but began creeping outward beneath his skin in faint branching lines, like dark roots spreading through soil, and terror replaced denial as Zachary confessed through sobs that he had stolen the blessing, that greed blinded him, that he never performed the required act of sacrifice, and Mama Hawa's cry pierced the night as she understood the full weight of her late husband's warning finally unfolding before her eyes. The pouch pulsed now with a sickly green glow visible even through fabric, each pulse synchronized with waves of pain that forced Zachary to curl inward helplessly, and in that moment wealth, contracts, vehicles, and status meant nothing against the reality of spiritual consequence tightening its grip. Dinladi looked from his brother's contorted face to the blackening skin and felt a storm of emotions, betrayal, sorrow, pity, colliding within him, yet above them all rose a single urgent truth: if the curse had awakened, only Yahweh might know how to confront it. Without hesitation they lifted Zachary between them despite his screams and began the desperate journey toward the edge of town, the once proud man reduced to a trembling shadow clutching his burning chest, unaware that the real reckoning had only begun and that sometimes the price of stolen blessings is not merely pain but a choice that tests the depth of every bond forged by blood. The journey to Yahweh's compound felt longer than any road they had ever walked, though in truth it was no more than 15 minutes from their home, yet when a man carries fire inside his chest every step stretches into eternity, and Zachary's screams tore through the silent night as Dinladi and Mama Hawa half-carried, half-dragged him along the dusty path while the pouch pulsed with a sickly green glow beneath his torn shirt. Neighbors peeked through cracked doors but dared not interfere, for suffering tied to spiritual matters invites fear more than sympathy, and by the time they reached the red and black hut at the edge of town, Zachary's voice had weakened into hoarse pleas barely rising above the wind. Before they could knock, the wooden door creaked open as if summoned by inevitability, and Yahweh stood framed by candlelight, her pale eyes reflecting neither surprise nor panic but the calm acknowledgement of consequences arriving exactly on schedule. Without greeting she motioned them inside where green flames flickered once more and shadows trembled against cracked walls, and as Zachary collapsed onto the floor writhing in agony, she observed him the way a judge observes a defendant already aware of the verdict. Mama Hawa fell to her knees begging for mercy, her hands trembling as she confessed her son's wrongdoing and pleaded for reversal, but Yawan's voice cut cleanly through desperation when she reminded them that the curse attached to the blessing was not rumor but law, activated the moment greed claimed what purity was meant to guard, and she explained that Zachary had been granted 7 days to cleanse his heart through genuine sacrifice, yet he chose pride repeatedly until the window closed like a slammed gate. Zachary, drenched in sweat and tears, promised to give away every naira he possessed, to repair every harm he had caused, to dedicate his life to charity if only the burning would stop, but Yawan shook her head slowly, telling him that repentance delayed until pain arrives often carries less power than obedience given freely, and that curses grow stronger with every ignored opportunity for goodness. The blackened marks on his chest had begun spreading toward his neck like creeping vines of rot, and his breathing grew shallow as if invisible fingers squeezed his lungs, prompting Dinladi to step forward despite the storm of betrayal still swirling within him. He asked if there remained any path at all to save his brother's life, even if the cost would be severe, and Yawan studied him carefully before revealing the truth in measured words, when a curse born from stolen blessing demands payment. Balance can only be restored through equivalent exchange, meaning one life must answer for another. Either Zachary would die within days as the corruption reached his heart, or someone bound by the same ancestral line could willingly take the curse upon themselves. The room fell silent so completely that even the candles seemed hesitant to flicker, and Mama Hawa gasped as if struck, offering her own life without hesitation, but Yawan dismissed the possibility, explaining that the spiritual inheritance traveled between brothers, not upward or outward, and only one who shared the father's bloodline equally could transfer the burden. Every eye turned toward Dinladi then, and in that suspended moment the weight of history, memory, anger, and love pressed against him simultaneously. He remembered the nights they shared a single mat as boys, the times Zachary shielded him from bullies despite later bitterness, the day their father's trembling hand placed the pouch in his possession, and the months of unexplained collapse after it vanished. Yet he also remembered forgiveness taught by elders who believed that family bonds, though strained, should not be severed by pride, and as he looked at his brother now reduced to trembling desperation, he realized that vengeance would not heal the emptiness created by loss. Still, the cost Yawan described was not symbolic but fatal. The curse would consume him just as it was consuming Zachary, and death would follow swiftly once transferred. Zachary, barely conscious, whispered broken apologies, insisting he deserved his fate and begging Dinladi not to sacrifice himself, but pain cannot erase the love forged by shared childhood, and tears blurred Dinladi's vision as he asked one final question: if he chose to take the curse, would Zachary live immediately? And Yawan confirmed that the transfer would release him at once, though the new bearer would suffer intensely and likely perish within days. Mama Hawa clutched her younger son's hands, pleading for restraint, reminding him that injustice should not demand further injustice, yet within Dinladi's quiet heart something deeper than fairness stirred, a conviction that compassion offered freely carries power beyond calculation. And though fear gripped his chest, he nodded slowly, accepting the unimaginable weight of choice that would determine whether this night ended in one grave or perhaps two, unaware that the true strength of a pure heart sometimes awakens forces even ancient curses cannot anticipate. The silence inside Yawan's hut thickened until even breath felt heavy, and as the green flames trembled against clay walls, Dinladi stepped forward with a calmness that did not come from lack of fear but from decision already made. He knelt beside Zachary, whose body convulsed in weakening spasms, the blackened veins crawling closer toward his throat, and placed a steady hand over his brother's burning chest, despite the heat biting into his palm, whispering that childhood arguments and stolen blessings could not erase blood shared since the womb, and that mercy, once chosen, must not tremble at the sight of cost. Mama Hawa clung to him desperately, tears soaking his shoulder as she pleaded for him to reconsider, yet he gently freed himself from her grip and looked toward Yawan with eyes no longer clouded by doubt, asking only what must be done. The old woman instructed him to remove his shirt and kneel opposite his brother, warning that once the invocation began there would be no reversal, that pain would arrive like a storm breaking bone and breath alike, and that death often followed within 3 days. When the curse found a new vessel, yet Dinladi nodded without hesitation, whispering a quiet prayer beneath his breath. Yawan drew a circle of white ash around both brothers and began chanting in a language older than the town itself, her voice rising and falling like distant thunder as the candles flared violently, and the leather pouch hanging from Zachary's neck started glowing brighter than ever before. A toxic green radiance pulsing in erratic bursts, she placed her wrinkled hands first upon Zachary's chest and then upon Dinladi's bare skin, and when she spoke the final words the pouch lifted from Zachary's body on its own as though pulled by invisible hands, the cord snapping free with a sound like cracking bone. What followed was not gentle, energy surged between them like lightning forced into flesh, and Dinladi's scream tore through the hut as the burning sensation struck him full force, far more violent than anything Zachary had endured, because curses resist purity the way darkness resists dawn. The blackened marks that had crept across Zachary's chest receded instantly, fading like ink washed by rain, while identical veins of charred corruption exploded outward across Dinladi's skin, branching across his ribs and shoulders in seconds, and he collapsed backward gasping as if the air itself had turned to fire. Zachary lay still, blinking in stunned confusion as the agony vanished from his body as suddenly as it had arrived, his chest now unmarked except for faint redness where the pouch once burned, and realization struck him harder than pain ever could when he saw his younger brother writhing in his place, skin darkening rapidly, lips trembling, eyes squeezed shut against unbearable torment. Guilt swallowed him whole, crushing every ounce of pride that had fueled his greed, and he crawled toward Dinladi sobbing apologies that could not undo what mercy had already sealed. Mama Hawa's cries echoed against the hut walls as she held her youngest son's head in her lap, rocking him while he struggled to breathe, and even Yawen's hardened expression softened briefly as she observed something unexpected unfolding before her eyes. The blackened veins on Dinladi's body did not spread in the same chaotic pattern as before but pulsed rhythmically, almost as if meeting resistance from within, and the green glow that had once radiated with corruption flickered uncertainly around him. Minutes stretched like hours until suddenly the pouch dropped between them, no longer glowing but dull and cracked, its leather splitting down the center as though unable to contain conflicting forces, and a shockwave of cool air swept through the hut extinguishing every candle at once. Darkness swallowed the room except for faint moonlight seeping through the doorway, and in that stillness Dinladi's breathing slowed from ragged gasps to steady rhythm, the charred veins fading gradually into pale scars rather than spreading toward his heart. Yawen stepped back in astonishment, murmuring that she had never witnessed such resistance, explaining in hushed awe that curses rooted in greed often consume quickly, but when transferred to a heart entirely free of selfish intent they weaken, starved by the absence of corruption to feed upon, and what should have been fatal had fractured instead. Zachary stared at his brother in disbelief as Dinladi's eyes fluttered open weakly, exhaustion replacing agony, and those scars remained etched across his chest. The burning had ceased. The pouch lay ruined on the floor, its power broken beyond repair, and Yawen declared that the ancestral blessing had chosen mercy over punishment, dissolving the curse entirely because sacrifice given willingly reshapes spiritual law itself. Yet she warned that such miracles do not erase consequences of character, only offer a second chance to rebuild it. Zachary collapsed beside his brother, weeping openly as he pressed his forehead to the ground in gratitude and shame intertwined. Understanding now that wealth without integrity rots from within and that the true inheritance their father left behind was never the pouch, but the choice between selfishness and love. Outside, dawn began creeping across the horizon, faint light painting the sky in fragile gold as the family stepped from the hut together, one brother scarred but alive, the other humbled but forgiven, and in that quiet morning air Zachary made a vow not born of fear this time but of clarity, that the fortune he rebuilt would rise from generosity rather than greed, because he had witnessed firsthand that when blood chooses mercy, even ancient curses must bow. The morning after the curse's transfer, Kafanshan seemed softer, gentler, as though the town itself had exhaled after a long-held breath. Dinladi sat on the worn veranda of his restored shop, his body still marked by faint scars from the night's ordeal, but his eyes sparkled with renewed determination. And Zachary approached slowly, carrying baskets of fresh produce he had bought with money earned honestly for the first time, his hands trembling slightly as he offered them without expectation of praise, a simple act that felt heavier than any he had ever attempted. The villagers, who had heard rumors of the brothers' trials, watched from alleyways and doorways, whispers spreading like warm wind, some skeptical, some hopeful, and Zachary, humbled by the raw edge of near death and the miracle of his brother's mercy, began learning that wealth gained through kindness grows steadily and without hidden poison. That day, they worked side by side, arranging yams, vegetables, and ground nuts in the shop, exchanging quiet conversation and occasional laughter that sounded fragile at first but gradually strengthened, filling the air with a sense of ordinary peace they had not known since childhood. Mama Hawa watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief, praying silently that the lessons of suffering and forgiveness would take root in both sons and in their community, and that the story of the cursed pouch would become a lesson told for generations, not merely of danger but of transformation. As the sun rose higher, children gathered near the edge of the compound, peering curiously at the brothers as they carried sacks of goods to the shop, and Zachary realized that each act of generosity, each small gesture of care, began to lighten the lingering shadows in his heart. Shadows that had once made him crave what belonged to others. By evening, the shop thrived again, not because magic had returned, but because human hearts, repaired, willing, and humble, had become vessels for blessings more enduring than gold. That night, as the family sat around a simple meal, Dinladi spoke quietly to his brother about lessons learned, about patience, about how courage and selflessness sometimes demand the heaviest price, yet yield the deepest reward, and Zachary nodded, tears glistening in his eyes, finally understanding that the true measure of a man is not in what he takes, but in what he chooses to give, and in that choice, he found the beginnings of redemption. Kafanchan slept under stars that night, unaware that its youngest citizens had witnessed a miracle not of lightning or thunder, but of hearts reborn, and the wind carried whispers of the story, like seeds of wisdom scattered to grow silently across the city. With the first light of dawn spilling across Kafanchan, Zachary stepped out of his home carrying a small bundle of coins and a heart heavy with regret yet brimming with determination. He walked through winding dusty streets, past crumbling zinc-roofed houses and vendors shouting over the clatter of morning life, seeking out those he had wronged, those whose livelihoods he had once envied or undermined, and offering his help with sincerity that surprised even himself. He repaired the broken fence of a neighbor's yard, delivered water to households who had been struggling during dry spells, and offered his knowledge and labor to assist in small businesses, listening attentively as elders shared their wisdom, and for the first time, he realized the weight and power of community trust, how easily it could be shattered and how slowly it could be rebuilt. Each act, however small, seemed to lighten the burden he had carried for years, and the villagers began noticing the change, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all intrigued by this once feared man who now moved with humility rather than arrogance. Dinladi, watching from the shop, offered quiet guidance, reminding Zachary that redemption is not a single act but a continuous path, walked with patience and integrity, and together they helped revive the village economy, exchanging goods fairly, sharing profits, and even organizing communal workdays where young and old participated, weaving bonds that had long frayed. By mid-afternoon, Zachary's energy wavered, yet the gratitude in the eyes of those he aided fueled him, and he reflected that true blessings are not inherited or stolen, they are earned through sacrifice, care, and courage to face one's own misdeeds. As evening fell, the village square was filled with soft laughter and chatter, a stark contrast to the tense whispers of months before, and Zachary returned home exhausted but fulfilled, carrying the awareness that the scars of the past remained as reminders but no longer as chains. He knelt beside his mother, seeking her silent approval, and she smiled, a mixture of relief and pride washing over her face, knowing that the boy who had once craved blessings now understood the weight of generosity. And that the real magic lay not in mystical pouches or stolen gifts but in the courage to act with a clean and willing heart, day after day, choice after choice, step by step. Months had passed since the night of the curse, yet every step Zachary took in Kafanchan felt like walking through a new world. His hands were calloused from labor, his clothes simple, yet his heart light, unburdened by envy or greed, and every person he helped left a ripple of gratitude that filled the town with warmth and trust. Together with Dinladi, he restored failing shops, shared crops from their fields with neighbors in need, and trained young apprentices, teaching not only commerce but patience, integrity, and kindness, so that each lesson became a seed of prosperity rooted in morality rather than magic. The leather pouch, once a vessel of envy and chaos, had long disappeared, its memory preserved only as a cautionary tale, yet the brothers' reputation grew not through fear or stolen blessings but through the visible evidence of a heart transformed. Zachary no longer sought what others had. He created abundance from his own labor and shared it freely, understanding finally that wealth without compassion is hollow. Mama Hawa, older now yet radiant with pride, watched her sons walk side by side through the streets, their laughter genuine, their bond unbreakable, and she knew that her family's true fortune was not measured in coins, crops, or land, but in forgiveness, unity, and love that could endure trials, curses, and human folly alike. The villagers, inspired by the brothers' example, began to help one another, forming networks of support, exchanging skills and resources, and creating a community where generosity became contagious, where children learned that kindness is stronger than fear, and where the lessons of one night of mystical horror had blossomed into a lifetime of ethical guidance. One evening, under a sky painted with gold and indigo, Zachary gathered a group of children around the fading embers of a small fire and recounted the story of the pouch, the curse, and the power of selfless love, emphasizing that true blessings are never stolen, but earned through courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to forgive. Dunlawdy smiled quietly from the side, seeing his brother fully transformed, no longer the man who envied or schemed, but a man who understood that the greatest magic in the world is love, unselfish and enduring, and as the firelight danced across their faces, the villagers felt that change was possible, that hearts could mend, and that every act of generosity, no matter how small, builds a legacy stronger than wealth, than fear, or than even the darkest curse, proving that in the end, the greatest treasure is a heart willing to give, a heart willing to forgive, and a family united in enduring love.